Archaeology. We biological stuff and biological anthropology will always be with us from now on. But technically, we're kind of finished up with our evolution and biological anthropology unit. We're going into archaeology, which Muckle and González and Camp start the archaeology part about 2.5 million years ago. And it's interesting because some textbooks put this in the biological evolution part because it starts pretty far back, the stone tools and stuff. So it's so far back that a lot of people they don't start the archaeology unit until later, like about 70,000 years ago, for reasons that we'll see, because archaeology gets much more exciting around 40, 50, 60,000 years ago than it was back at 2.5 million years ago. But they do this for the reason that this is the first time, and I've underlined, emphasis added, we have the undisputed manifestation of culture in the form of preserved stone tools. So those, we have undisputed stone tools at about 2.5 million years ago. Now we've talked about culture as learned behavior. We can sometimes, some people see this as happening as early as bipedalism and walking and learning how to walk. And we can also see culture in the form of tools that are formed from other things that have decayed, like sticks and things that chimpanzees use, and leaves for tools. But these are things that are found in the archaeological record, and they're still here today, and so we can date them to about 2.5 million years ago. And so for the first part of this unit, we're basically going to be going way back into what is called the Paleolithic, which we had been talking about before, but in terms of the biological stuff, now we're going to be doing more of the cultural stuff that was happening in the Paleolithic. Now, at this point, I'd like to pause and go back to a question that Cass asked in the comments on what is the difference between a paleontologist and a paleoanthropologist. And I was composing something there, and then I was composing an answer, and then I started getting really snarky, and I decided I needed to cut down the level of snark. But the reason I get snarky about this is because paleo is just what we call the Stone Age. We used to just call it the Stone Age, and paleo means ancient or old, and lithic means stone. And so it sounds pretty cool to call it the Paleolithic, but really we're just swapping around some terminology there. And as far as I can tell, the difference between a paleontologist is somebody who studies really old stuff, all the stuff, and a paleoanthropologist is somebody who studies the old human stuff. So, like I said, I was trying to write that out, and then I realized that it was hard for me to not be irreverent in answering that. But if you look at the chart on page 115, where they divide it between the lower Paleolithic, the middle Paleolithic, and the upper Paleolithic, and again, on these terms, I am much more of a lumper, not a splitter. They go up from about 3 million years ago through about 12,000 years ago. Well, why does the Paleolithic end at 12,000 years ago? That's mainly when we see, which we'll talk about in this unit, the introduction of, or people agree that that's when agriculture comes out and gets really important in life. So, we are basically talking about the Stone Age, and we can divide it into different eras if we wish. But basically really old stuff, pre-agriculture stuff. And agriculture has often marked a boundary line. We'll again debate whether that should be as much of a boundary line as people have made it out to be. But that's where we are. We're in an era from perhaps as early as 3.3 million years ago. So some people have argued a recent find, which Muckle, González, and Camp discuss a bit on page 123, that maybe we can see some stone tools as early as 3.3 million years ago in Kenya. So the 2.5 million year ago stone tools are pretty well established, but recently we found some 3.3 million years ago. But are they? That's the problem with this. Is it really a stone tool? Is it evidence that human or whatever with the creatures were around were making this into a tool? You really have to look pretty closely to try and figure out if that is a tool or not. And some people have seen that there are, for example, some capuchin monkeys who like to bang stones together. And if you look at what results from them just banging stones together for fun, it's hard to distinguish that from some of these early stone tools. So this always comes up for debate as to what exactly when this happened. So I'll put a question mark there. There are some stone tools that emerge that are called the hand axe, which is definitely been constructed or been made by the Homo populations at the time, and because they have pretty remarkable durability. By the way, though, when I say hand axe, what are you expecting to see? Yeah. Yeah, we're expecting an axe, something with something wood attached to something stone. Well, I told my wife I was doing the hand axe, and she's like, "Why do they call them that?" I'm like, "I don't know. You actually can't use this as an axe because the edges are sharp, and so if you just took it in your hand and tried to use it in your hand, it would cut your hand up too much." So I think it's called this because they basically form, they're kind of in the shape of a hand and the edges get sharp. But if you look on page 124, this one, by the way, is from about 780,000 years ago. There's an article titled "The Hand Axe Reconsidered." And the title of this box 5.3 is called "Acheulean Hand Axe, Tool, Core, or Sexual Object, question mark." Let's just forget the sexual object thing. The thing is that there's some debate about what these things were actually used for. Maybe throwing, maybe scraping and carving, maybe used for different things at different places. The reason some people say core, bless you, is that some people think this is simply the leftover from what may have been a different tool. And so these things are just the kind of the garbage from the other kinds of tool manufacture. That doesn't seem right either. Anyway, these things actually show remarkable stability over a pretty long period of time. They're pretty widespread throughout this period of about 2 million years to 1 million year ago. So they're, it's a really, they're called the Swiss Army rocks because they're perhaps multifunctional, but it does, I mean, you can't really tell what they were used for. So yeah, but we know they aren't like an axe. Yeah. Right. Right.
Where do you draw the line between finding and something about it or sitting up and saying you don't know what it was used for?
Well, we'll talk about that a lot in the next class on Wednesday. So keep that question in mind. I mean, I think I guess it depends on there's these sort of eternal questions, right? And I mean, I think it's worthwhile to speculate, but it's also worthwhile to be a little bit humble in this too, and say, we're never going to know, and it's nice to keep accumulating information, but there's probably a lot of variability here. I think we're about to talk about fire, for example, when and where, and there's some things that are more indisputable than others. But part of it is individual certainty and just kind of where you want to draw the line. Like I said, I'm kind of a lumper on a lot of these things, and I'm more of a skeptic on a lot of these things. I mean, I think we can see that there is, as it talks about, I think this article by Wynne and Gauntlet suggests that the hand axe design results from neither strict functionality nor aesthetics, but a combination of both. Like, there is something aesthetically wonderful about the hand axe. And one anthropologist that I like a lot about this, who's not an archaeologist, but simply suggests that it forms, it's almost a perfect cup of the hand. And so there's something really, it is almost in some ways biologically like the creatures that made them. And so, I find that compelling in a way. Does that satisfy our answer of why it is? For me, it makes me happy, but I'm not sure it's entirely. Just to add to that, though, when we say stone tools and hand axes and talk about all these things, who do we think is doing all this stone tool stuff? What kind of people? What images come to our mind? Yeah. Primitive people, and I don't know. For me, I start thinking about the Flintstones and all those guys. And I just, and this is another thing that we can use, that we always have to be careful about using to try to interpret what was going on in the past. But there are some contemporary anthropologists who look at societies in other parts of the world and say, wait a second, what's interesting here is at least some of these societies, often it's the women who are making and using the stone tools. Now, does that mean that we can project back into the past and say, aha, it must have been women doing this? No, we cannot do that. However, we do want to clear our heads of the conception that it had to be, big guys doing stone tools back in the day. So, again, this is something we call this in archaeology ethnographic analogy. So looking at the practices of people that we can see in contemporary peoples, hopefully in the area in which the artifacts were discovered, and then making inferences about the past. Now, you always have to be really careful with that, because we can often do some pretty bad inferences about the past, but it can be useful, at least in shaking up or shaking up some of our conceptions about this. So again, I am not saying that this was women, men, or anybody else. I'm just saying that in some contemporary evidence, it's often women, and we cannot count that out as a possibility for what was going on. As I said, we're going to be talking here about fire a little bit and when it happened. So there have been some people, I'll just put this up in the box on page 119, Food Matters Was Cooking the Driving Force of Human Evolution, where they talk about Richard Wrangham's book, How Cooking Made Us Human, Catching Fire. And he wants to put it back at about cooking at about 1.8 million years ago with Homo erectus, which would be a pretty long time ago very long time. And then he wants to argue that all kinds of things happened because of cooking, and we're able to then process the meat and cook it and get brains growing bigger and all those wonderful things. Most anthropologists, I think, would say that probably in terms of controlled fire and cooking, we're in the hundreds of thousands of years ago range, not the 1.8 million. That seems a little early. I think they say that there's indisputable evidence at 40,000 years ago, but that's when we have evidence that is like super, you can't argue with it. It's like definitely, I think most people would say we're probably somewhere between 40,000 and 1.8 million, maybe in the middle or something. So, I mean, I think that again, on these things, you always have to be careful of people, or you always have to be careful of things that want to say that one thing made us human, and also that everybody wants to be the first to discover something. So there's no fun being the person who says, well, I discovered the second time humans did this. It's just, you're not going to get a big headline out of it. So I was initially reluctant. I gave you this cover about this book, First Steps, How Upright Walking Made Us Human, because it has some of that same, oh, wait, well, which was it? Was it cooking? Was it upright walking? Who knows? When I typed into Google how something made us human, I come up with how cooking made us human, or how water made us human, compassion, feet, upright walking, monogamy, definitely not, but you know, people are interested in that. Ethics, maybe. Fire, running. Other people say meat, other people say language. I guess my point is, be careful with any sort of one factor thing. There's probably a lot of things going on. I mean, I think in terms of the bipedalism, we can say that that is what separates out some of the first hominin lineages from others that would go and become more like contemporary apes. But in some of this other stuff, I think that we just have to be careful about single motor, single origin ideas, in the same way that we were careful about single factor ideas for bipedalism or walking. So, as I said, archaeology gets perhaps more exciting at about 70,000 years ago, when you have some of this stuff beginning to come together as a package that allows the Homo sapiens to expand their range and to spread out into different places all over the planet. And especially on Friday, we'll be talking about the expansion of the Homo sapiens, the human range, especially into the Americas. But the tool use seems to, I mean, we see people co-evolving with tools from 3 million, 2.5 million, 1 million years ago. But the first tools, those hand axes that we talked about, are pretty remarkably stable and don't show a lot of proliferation for quite a long time, maybe about 1 million years. And there does seem to be a kind of acceleration, you might say, in terms of the feedback loop of tool use and how that became important from generation to generation. So the tools become more sophisticated at about 70,000 years ago. Different techniques for gathering plants and for hunting animals start to be adapted. And then the use of fire is probably by 70,000 years ago. We have, as we said, undisputable evidence at 40,000 years ago, but most likely being used in various ways at this time. And all of these things are crucial for what we'll talk about is the expansion of the Homo sapien range. Because what we have here are creatures that are not they don't have to change biologically in order to live in a whole wide range of habitats. And so things get perhaps more archaeologically interesting as you have more artifacts that represents these adaptable lifestyles. In terms of the social groups, and again, we'll talk about the expansion of the Homo sapien range, but I really want to emphasize here the things that we're reading back in the section on social system in Muckle, González, and Camp on page 120. As humans expanded, they are always connected to each other. There are no groups that become isolated from each other. We talked about that is why the idea of a subspecies for race doesn't work, because they were connected to each other. They were trading stuff around, and they also had what we call exogamous marriages. So that meant that you had to marry outside of your kin group. And so as we have these probably small groups of people, 30, 50 to 70 people, but the people who would be in a group are going to change, what we call fluid group membership. So it's not just the same people, it's not just one group of kin that are in a group. And so we often sometimes refer to these as kin-based societies, or societies that are based on their kinship or family organization. And of course, that's important. Kinship is important, but it is not, and this is not something that completely defined these groups. Again, people often left their groups to marry in other groups, as we saw back in the non-human primates, females or males leaving the group. And if we look at contemporary societies of gatherers and hunters, it's quite incredible how many unrelated people you find in the group, because people are relatively free to move around, and there's not these national boundaries and borders and walls and passports to be restricting people's movement. So people could and did move around a lot, both between groups and across territories during this time. So this is extremely important to us as we think about the expansion of and the development of different groups over the archaeological space. As I talked about, archaeology becomes more interesting at about 70,000 years ago, and we get all these neat little terms that the archaeologists use for things like habitation sites and base camps, places that you start to see accumulation of artifacts where people live. You start to see rock art. So you have the pictographs, or painting on stone surfaces, and the petroglyphs, engravings made on rock surfaces. And that seems to appear in the archaeological record at about 65,000 years ago. So of course we can admire the cave paintings of 30 to 35,000 years ago, but as we go outside of the European range, we see rock art emerging in Africa and in Australia, probably around 65,000 years ago. So again, this is an important period where these kinds of artifacts start to come together as a package in various Homo sapien sites almost over the habitable world. In the same sense, we start to see more clearly defined artifacts, or things that are made by humans. Hearths, that's when you try and figure out if people are using fire, and how, if it's a discrete contained fire, that is to say it's something that is being controlled. Lithic scatters, the accumulation of waste flakes created and left behind from the manufacture of stone tools. So some people have interpreted those hand axes as cores or as part of the lithic scatter, but obviously when you're making stone tools, you're going to have a bunch of flakes and scatters around, and then middens, which are just discrete accumulations of trash. I guess that's the archaeologists like to say they're studying middens instead of studying garbage. It sounds better to call it a midden, but if they try to trick you and say they're studying middens, just know they're just studying the leftover stuff. They discuss here that we want to figure out what was going on in the environment, what people might have been hunting and gathering in a particular environment. So trying to figure out the paleo environment, the ancient environment, and diet. So plants and animals, and then of course looking for what people were eating, and especially the faunal remains, any part of an animal which can be identified. And the thing is that most of the faunal remains that are going to be identified in archaeological sites are bones, because they're going to be things that are still around and preserved. So the other things like hides and hair and fur and nails and claws and those things are probably going to disappear. So the bones will be around, and especially the large bones. The larger bones are going to preserve better than the smaller bones. So this leads us, it leads us to a kind of issue about what the kinds of things that show up in the archaeological record, together with the way in which archaeology has been practiced. There's high potential for bias on this. So this high potential comes from a number of factors. The first is that, as we've been talking about, and as Cass raised, that it's very difficult to figure out what an object was used for, or what kind of social structure people had from what was left behind. So what we want to know is about the culture and way of life of people, but doing that simply from material artifacts is very difficult, and you can have very different social systems with pretty much the same materials, material culture. So that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem, or another part of the problem, is that the record is quite incomplete. We saw this with the fossil record as well, but it's certainly true of the archaeological record. A lot of this stuff disappears and was not preserved. I mean, if you're throwing things into a midden, it's not because you wanted those things around. You wanted to get rid of them, and you're hoping they're going to go away. So the archaeological record is incomplete. And then, as I mentioned, the organic remains, those things that, the stuff that's going to rot away completely disappears. A lot of the little tiny bones disappear too, and they're gone and you can't find them. So you're left with the larger bones. So what does that mean? For one thing, it means it's very easy to read our own modern ideas, our own bias onto the past, and to go looking for things that we do now and say, aha, when did this start? We don't know. It may have had multiple starts. And so you always have to be careful about looking for the origins of your own social system or your own ideas, and looking for them as if they had to have a startup point and were kind of located inevitably in the past. What else do we want to look out for, Ariana? What kind of stuff gets in the way of our interpretation? Yeah, be careful of those. And because archaeology basically originated in Europe and certain parts of North America, it often comes with a European or a Eurocentric bias, which means most of it has been done in the areas around Europe and in parts of North America. And certainly when you are describing other peoples and we talked about this very early on in the first chapter. Maybe we should start using ancestors to replace skeletal remains and belongings to replace artifacts. Maybe we should stop talking about sites and start talking about villages or gathering places. Right. So I think that this is something that we probably should start to do, recognizing that simply replacing terminology is not necessarily going to change the practices of power, but it can be a start. So you have to watch out for the terms that are used, because some of them are actually not neutral. And so then, well, Delaney, what else do we have to look out for in terms of bias?
Bias is male led, so a lot of the focus is going to be on practices that are believed to be male dominated.
That are believed to be male dominated. Yes, archaeology has been, for various reasons, especially conducive to male bias. And again, that has something to do with just the big bones being preserved over time and the kinds of stuff that gets preserved in the archaeological record. So that is actually going to be the main thing that we focus on, are interpretations of archaeological artifacts in the next class. And